On the 22nd of January, in the year 1889, at 4:30 in the morning, a 44-year-old Norwegian-American widow named Ingrid Halvorsen stood in the doorway of a hewn redwood cabin at 5,400 feet of elevation on the southwest flank of Lassen Peak and looked down at the snow. The snow was 9 feet deep on the level and 12 feet deep in the drifts, and the sky above the snow was the kind of pewter that meant it was about to start coming down again. Behind her, in a long lean-to that bridged the cabin and the redwood-and-glass greenhouse, 2 pale cream Norwegian fjord horses named Brage and Skjelm were already in harness in front of a heavy bobsled. The bed of the bobsled held 31 wooden crates packed in straw and lined with sailcloth. Inside the crates were 140 fresh pineapples of the Cayenne variety, 312 lemons, 480 Valencia oranges, 63 hands of ladyfinger bananas, and 170 passionfruit. The crates had come out of the greenhouse the day before at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and they were going 41 miles down off the mountain to a town that had formally banished her 16 months earlier, and that had now run entirely out of fresh fruit, and that had 49 of its own children laid up with the bleeding gums and the loose teeth and the slow weakness of the old scurvy. She buckled the last harness ring. She kissed the soft white gray of Brage's nose. She climbed up to the driver's bench, and she said, in Norwegian, the way her late husband Halldor had taught her to speak to horses, "We go now. We go to the children." This is the story of Ingrid Halvorsen of Lassen. She was born in 1844 in a fjordside town called Bergen on the rain-gray coast of Norway. Her father was a glasshouse foreman at the city's botanical garden, and her mother was the daughter of a Bergen sailmaker. From the age of 7, Ingrid swept the brick floors of the glasshouses, washed the panes, and learned by watching her father how a glass roof in Norway could keep cucumbers and tomatoes alive through the dark months when the city outside was buried in cold and slush. By the age of 15, she could draft a glasshouse plan in her own hand. By the age of 17, she had been offered an apprenticeship at the Royal Garden in Oslo, then called Christiania. She did not take it. She wanted, she said to her younger sister Solveig, to see whether the same glass and the same fire could be made to keep a pineapple alive in a place where pineapples had never grown. In the year 1862, at the age of 18, she boarded a Hamburg America Line steamer at Bergen with her father's blessing and 46 American dollars in a leather pouch sewn into the lining of her wool coat. She came through the long crossing to New York, took the Erie Canal route west, and arrived by Pacific mail steamer in San Francisco Bay in the spring of 1863. She worked 4 years at a market garden in San Mateo, learning English and Spanish from the Mexican workers and Cantonese from a Chinese head gardener named Mr. Fong, who taught her how to graft citrus. In 1867, in the lobby of a small Eureka hotel where she had gone to visit a cousin, she met a 31-year-old Icelandic geological engineer named Halldor Halvorsen. Halldor had come to California by way of Copenhagen and Boston to design boilers for the Eureka Lumber Company. They were married in a Lutheran chapel 4 months later. He spoke 6 languages and read every geological survey he could lay his hands on. She had brought from Norway every botanical book that had been small enough to fit in her one trunk. Halldor's father had been foreman of the steamline crews at the geothermal bathhouses of Reykjavik in the 1860s, and Halldor had grown up in the steam, learning by the age of 12 the difference between the steam that scalds and the steam that warms and the steam that withers green, growing things by the chemistry of its dissolved acids. His apprenticeship had been spent at the Krusuvik sulfur works on the Reykjanes Peninsula, where he had watched the Danish overseers run sulfur vapors through limestone and charcoal traps to draw the metal acids out before they crossed the threshold of the workshop. He had carried that schooling with him to Copenhagen and Boston and Eureka, and at last to Lassen Peak, along with a leather portfolio of 41 engineering drawings copied by his own hand from the Krusuvik master sets. In the spring of 1873, Halldór and Ingrid filed a preemption claim on 240 acres on the southwest flank of Lassen Peak in Tehama County, California. The acres lay at 5,400 feet of elevation on a south-facing meadow above the headwaters of Mill Creek, with 3 steaming fumaroles in a sulfur-stained basin a quarter-mile above the cabin site. Halldór named the basin the Devil's Garden, after a passage he had read in an Icelandic geological journal about the hot ground at Krusuvik. The vents themselves he named, in the careful way he named all things, the Big Whistler at 312 degrees Fahrenheit of steam, the Lady's Sigh at 248, and the Soft Hiss at 197. For the first 6 years, he and Ingrid built only the hewn log cabin and a small one-pane glass house heated by an iron wood stove. They lived on what they could grow and what Halldór could earn by traveling to Sacramento and Anderson to consult on boiler installations. In the autumn of 1881, after a 4-month survey of the Devil's Garden Basin with copper thermometers and a hand-drafted topographic map, Halldór sat down at the cabin's long table and drew, in pencil on heavy linen paper, the first full engineering plan of a greenhouse that would be heated entirely by the steam of the Big Whistler. The plan called for a redwood frame 80 feet long and 24 feet wide, glazed with 2 layers of hand-blown crown glass and warmed by a closed-loop cast-iron radiant pipe system fed by a copper heat exchanger that would never let the sulfurous fumarole steam touch the plants directly. In 1883, Halldór added to the plan the most particular piece of the entire design, a 3-stage scrubber of crushed limestone and granular charcoal that would strip the hydrogen sulfide from the steam before it ever reached the heat exchanger. He wrote in the margin, in his careful blue ink, 4 Icelandic words. Translated, they read, "The breath of the earth, when it is washed, is gentle." The scrubber, in service, took 3 forms of vigilance. Every morning, Ingrid lifted the cast-iron lid of the first chamber and measured the surface acidity of the limestone with folded blue litmus paper. Every fortnight, she shoveled out the spent limestone and topped the chamber with fresh quarry stone from Manton. Every spring, she pulled and replaced the granular charcoal of the second chamber with fresh burnt manzanita from the property windfall. The third chamber she did not open. The third chamber held only a copper coil and a single drain cock for the condensate that returned, sweet and slow, to the storage tank at the head of the radiant pipe loop. It was Halldór's invention. In all her years running the greenhouse, the third chamber never failed. On the morning of the 7th of May, in 1885, Ingrid Halvorsen was crushed under a falling boiler cradle in the steam mill yard of the Anderson Lumber Company. He was 48 years old. He was brought home in a wagon. He was buried on the meadow above the cabin, in sight of the 3 steaming fumaroles, on the 9th of May. Ingrid was 40 years old. For a full year she did not pick up the plans. She walked the meadow, fed the cabin stove, kept the small glass house alive, and read aloud to herself, in the evenings, from Haldor's books on Icelandic geothermal practice, and from her own books on Royal Hortus glasshouse design. In the spring of 1886, she wrote 2 letters, both in her own hand. The first she sent to her younger brother, Ingrid Halvorsen, who had immigrated 3 years after her, and who was working as a journeyman boilermaker at the Sacramento Iron Works. The letter asked Olav to come up to the cabin for the summer and help her build the copper heat exchanger from her late husband's drawings. The second letter she sent to a Sacramento glassblower named Wilhelm Krause, a Bavarian who had set up a glass shop on R Street and who specialized in hand-blown crown glass. The letter asked Wilhelm to blow 47 roof panes of double-strength crown glass to her late husband's specifications, each pane numbered and signed. Olav came in June. Wilhelm sent the first crate of glass in August. The redwood frame went up by the end of October. The cast-iron radiant pipes were laid through the winter of 1886 to 87 under 3 feet of snow, in shifts of 2 hours warm and 1 hour cold. The 3-stage scrubber, the most delicate piece, was built in March and April of 1887 in the cabin's kitchen with crushed limestone hauled by mule from a quarry near Manton and granular charcoal made on the property from Windfall Manzanita. On the 14th of May in 1887, 2 years and 1 week after Haldor's funeral, Ingrid Halvorsen turned the brass shut-off valve at the head of the big whistler and let the first thin filament of scrubbed, washed, gentled steam climb the copper heat exchanger and warm the cast-iron pipes that ran along the floor of an 80-foot redwood-and-glass greenhouse. She walked the length of the building 3 times in the cool May morning and watched the interior temperature climb to 62 degrees Fahrenheit. She knelt down and pressed her cheek to the warm cast iron. She did not weep. She had wept enough. She had planted, in the soil beds and on the benches and along the trellises, the first commercial inventory she could afford. In the ground beds went 42 Cayenne pineapple slips brought up by stage from a Hawaiian importer in San Francisco. On the mid-bench went 36 ladyfinger and 24 Cavendish banana corms shipped from a Cuban broker in Havana via the Pacific Mail. Along the top trellis went 68 passionfruit vines and 47 Valencia orange seedlings. At the cool north wall, in their own cold-frame partition, she planted lemons of the Eureka variety and limes of the Mexican variety, both grown from cuttings she had carried up from her old San Mateo employer. The first pineapple fruited on the 7th of July, 1887. She cut 5 fruits that morning. She wrapped them in newspaper and carried them down to the post office at Mineral on her own back and shipped them by stage and rail to the Palace Hotel in San Francisco. 3 weeks later, a Palace Hotel buyer named James McCoy wrote her a contract for every pineapple she could grow at $1.75 per fruit, double the going Hawaiian wholesale. By the 1st of September, 1887, word had reached the Red Bluff Camp Meeting Association that a widow on the flank of Lassen Peak was harnessing the breath of the Devil's Garden to grow tropical fruit in defiance of the seasons God Almighty had ordained for the placement of fruit upon the earth. The Camp Meeting Association was an annual gathering founded in 1873 by Methodist Episcopal congregations of Tehama and Shasta counties, and that year its program committee was chaired by a 54-year-old preacher named the Reverend Augustus Pemberton of the Red Bluff Methodist Episcopal Church South. The Reverend Pemberton was the descendant of a Maryland Methodist line and a man of fierce, learned, narrow conviction. He preached on the 5th Sunday of September, 1887, a sermon titled, "Of the Breath of the Pit and the Folly of Drawing Therefrom." A printed pamphlet of that sermon survives in the Tehama County Historical Society archive in Red Bluff today. He was joined in his concern by a 38-year-old Cornell-trained natural history scholar named Dr. Phineas Lockwood, who in October of that year published a letter in the Sacramento Bee calling the Halvorsen enterprise, in his own phrase, geological lunacy that would end in eruption. And by the Tehama County Sheriff, Jeremiah Coates, 49 years old, a former Union cavalry captain who had risen to office on a platform of public order and who on the 11th of November served Ingrid Halvorsen in person at her cabin door, a formal Tehama County notice under the heading Public Nuisance Sulfurous Emanations. Two senior women of the Red Bluff Methodist Society, Mrs. Cordelia Pemberton and Mrs. Lavinia Lockwood, accompanied the three men. The five of them, standing in a tight line on the snow-dusted threshold of Ingrid Halvorsen's cabin on the 11th of November, 1887, read aloud a formal notice of banishment from the Methodist congregation, from the Red Bluff camp meeting, and from the social registers of Tehama County town life. Ingrid Halvorsen read the notice 3 times in the snow at her own door. She thanked the five of them for the trouble of the ride. She walked back inside her warm cabin and she shut the door. That winter, she made her first full commercial shipment. By the end of February 1888, the Palace Hotel of San Francisco, the Baldwin Hotel of San Francisco, the Russ House of San Francisco, the Capitol Hotel of Sacramento, and the Western Hotel of Marysville were all carrying winter pineapple and winter lemon and winter banana on their breakfast menus, every fruit shipped by sled and rail out of an exiled Norwegian widow's greenhouse on the flank of Lassen Peak. The Sacramento Bee, in March of that year, did not print a retraction. In the summer of 1888, Olav came up again, and the two of them extended the greenhouse to its full-planned 80-foot length. They added 2 more ground beds, a second mid-bench, and a citrus colonnade along the south glass wall that held 31 young trees, 20 Valencia oranges, 6 Eureka lemons, 3 Mexican limes, and 2 pomelos. The triple bank planting was complete by the 1st of August. Ingrid hired a Mexican-American woman from Vina named Esperanza Morales, 24 years old, to come up 4 days a week as her assistant and apprentice. She paid Esperanza $12 a week and full room. She kept on adding to the inventory. By the autumn of 1888, the greenhouse held 142 pineapples bearing or near to bearing, 360 citrus trees of 3 species, 84 banana plants of 2 species, 112 passionfruit vines, and a small cold-frame block of papaya and guava seedlings from a Hawaiian importer in Honolulu. And in the late autumn of 1888, the winter that became known in California, weather records as the Great Blizzard Winter of 1888 to 89 began. On the 18th of December, the snow began on Lassen Peak and did not properly stop until the 4th of March. The lower Sacramento Valley took heavy storms. Red Bluff was snowbound for 11 days, running in the 2nd week of January, 1889, the longest such isolation in the town's history. The Southern Pacific tracks south of Redding were buried in drifts. No fresh shipments of citrus had come into Red Bluff from Southern California since the 7th of July, 1888, the day a teamster's wagon load of Riverside oranges had reached the town from the south. By the second week of January, 1889, the canned and dried stores of Red Bluff were running short on vitamin-bearing food, the chemistry of which was not yet understood, but the symptoms of which were unmistakable. The bleeding gums began first at the Tehama County Orphan Asylum, a brick building 3 blocks east of the Methodist Episcopal Church South. By the 17th of January, 31 of the asylum's children, ages 4 to 14, were showing the slow weakness, the loose teeth, the dark bruising at the hips and ankles of the old scurvy. By the 18th, 18 more children of Red Bluff working families were in the same condition, including the 2 daughters of Sheriff Jeremiah Coates and the 7-year-old granddaughter of the Reverend Augustus Pemberton, a curly-haired girl named Eliza. On the morning of the 18th of January, 1889, the matron of the orphan asylum, a sister of charity named Sister Mary Catherine, sat at the asylum's office desk and wrote a letter by hand. She wrote, in 23 careful lines, that the children in her care were sliding into the same slow, loose-toothed condition that had emptied Sacramento children's homes in 1849, that she had read in the San Francisco papers that the Halvorsen greenhouse on Lassen Peak was carrying winter citrus, and that she was writing to ask, as a fellow Christian, whether Mrs. Halvorsen would be willing to sell or to send any quantity of her fruit to the asylum children at any price. She gave the letter to a Wells Fargo Express rider, a young man named Thomas Vargas, who had once worked 4 months at Halvorsen's greenhouse, and asked him to carry it up the mountain. Thomas Vargas reached the Halvorsen cabin door at 2:30 in the afternoon of the 20th of January, having broken trail through 5 feet of snow on the last 6 miles. Ingrid Halvorsen read the letter at her kitchen table, by lamplight, 3 times. She did not pause to think about the formal banishment of the 11th of November, 1887, because the question whether to refuse on grounds of the banishment was, to her, not a question. She rose, she put the kettle on for Thomas, and she walked across the lean-to and opened the greenhouse door and stood in the warm cinnamon and banana and citrus air for a long, quiet moment. Then she walked back to the kitchen and began to write out, in her own hand, an inventory of every ripe and near-ripe fruit then on the property. She spent the 21st of January packing crates. With Esperanza Morales, she packed 140 fresh Cayenne pineapples in straw and sailcloth, 312 Eureka and Mexican lemons, 480 Valencia oranges, 63 hands of ladyfinger bananas, and 170 passion fruit. 31 crates in all. She carried out of the cabin a pair of long Norwegian skis that had been Haldor's, a pair of his snowshoes, his old Krysavik geological compass, and a sealskin coat that had been her father's. She harnessed Braga and Skjelm at 4 in the morning of the 22nd of January. At 4:30, she stood in the cabin doorway and said the small Norwegian sentence to the horses. They started down. The first mile took an hour and 20 minutes. By dusk, she had made 11 miles. She slept that night under the bobsled with the horses tethered to the sled runners, the 2 of them breathing white into the dark sky. By the dusk of the 23rd, she had made 26 miles. By 2 in the afternoon of the 24th, exhausted, frostbitten on the second knuckle of her left thumb, but otherwise upright, Ingrid Halvorsen drove her sled team down the snowbound main street of Red Bluff, California, with 31 crates of fresh tropical fruit in the bed, and pulled up at the front steps of the Tehama County Orphan Asylum. Sister Mary Catherine came down the front steps in her white coif. Thomas Vargas had ridden ahead and roused half the town. There was no welcoming committee. There were no flowers. There was a thin line of townspeople at the curbside, silent, watching. The sister and Esperanza Morales, who had ridden the last 15 miles up on the bobsled, unloaded the crates onto the asylum porch. Within 40 minutes, the first ripe Valencia oranges were being pressed, and the first pineapples cut, and the first lemon juice being stirred with maple syrup into a tonic. 49 children began, that afternoon, to take in fresh citrus. On the morning of the 25th, the second wagon load of crates went 2 blocks west to the Coates house, and to the Pemberton house, and to 16 other working families' houses, where the same fruit was distributed without payment. Ingrid Halvorsen accepted, for the entire 31 crates of January 24th, no money at all. The first child stood up on the 4th of February. Her name was Eliza Pemberton, 7 years old, the granddaughter of the Reverend Augustus Pemberton. The Reverend Pemberton walked the 4 blocks from his parsonage to the boarding house on Pine Street, where Ingrid had taken a room and where she was sleeping for the 3rd night in a row, fully clothed, on top of the bed. He knocked twice. He stood with his hat in his hands in the boarding house hallway. He asked, in plain language, whether Mrs. Halvorsen would permit him to apologize to her, in her own room, for the formal banishment notice of the 11th of November, 1887. Ingrid Halvorsen opened the door wider and asked him in and offered him the boarding house chair. The conversation lasted 41 minutes. When the Reverend Pemberton stepped back into Pine Street, the second snow of the week was beginning to fall. He walked back to the parsonage and he sat down at his study desk and he wrote by hand an addendum to his Sunday sermon. The Sunday sermon he had been preparing was titled, "Of the Breath of the Pit and the Folly of Drawing Therefrom." He crossed out the title and wrote a new title in its place, "Of the Breath that has been washed and the hand that has washed it." Dr. Phineas Lockwood walked to the boarding house on the 7th of February. Sheriff Jeremiah Coates walked there on the 9th. Mrs. Cordelia Pemberton and Mrs. Lavinia Lockwood walked there together on the 11th. All 5 of them apologized, each in turn, each to Ingrid Halvorsen alone in the boarding house room, each in plain language. By the 14th of February, all 49 of the Red Bluff children who had been showing the symptoms of the old scurvy were upright, and color was coming back into their gums, and teeth that had wobbled were beginning to seed again. On the 12th of March, 1889, the Red Bluff Camp Meeting Association held an extraordinary meeting at the Red Bluff Methodist Episcopal Church South. The meeting was open to the public. The minutes survive in the Tehama County Historical Society archive. By unanimous vote, the association rescinded the formal banishment of the 11th of November, 1887, ordered the printing of 200 broadsheets carrying the rescission and an apology written by the Reverend Pemberton, and authorized the printing of a separate broadsheet of thanks signed by the parents and guardians of the 49 recovering children. The County Board of Supervisors, 2 weeks later, voted to fund a public horticultural greenhouse on the courthouse grounds, 80 feet long and 24 feet wide, glazed with hand-blown crown glass from Wilhelm Krauss of Sacramento, designed in every line by Ingrid Halvorsen, heated by an iron stove and not by any fumarole, and named on the cornerstone, in raised brass letters, the Halvorsen Glass. The Halvorsen Glass was dedicated on the 8th of May, 1889. Ingrid Halvorsen rode down from Lassen Peak with Esperanza Morales on the bench beside her. She wore a plain dark wool dress and her father's sealskin coat. The Reverend Pemberton read the dedication. Dr. Lockwood read the engineering specifications aloud, which he had transcribed in his own hand from her drawings. Sheriff Coates stood quietly at the back. Mrs. Cordelia Pemberton and Mrs. Lavinia Lockwood carried in the first young Valencia orange tree, donated by the Halvorsen greenhouse, and the two of them planted it together in the central ground bed. The dedication speech of the Reverend Pemberton on the 8th of May, 1889, was printed in full in the Red Bluff Daily News on the 9th. He read the 4 Icelandic words of Halldór Halvorsen's margin note. He read them slowly. He read them twice. Then he set down the pamphlet and said, to a courthouse lawn crowd of 246 citizens of Tehama County, that the breath of the mountain, when it is washed, is gentle, and that the same may be said, with God's grace, of a town that has wronged a widow and come back to ask her pardon. Ingrid Halvorsen lived another 35 years on the southwest flank of Lassen Peak. She built 4 more greenhouses on the property, each one heated by a separately tapped vent, each one with its own 3-stage scrubber, each one glazed with Wilhelm Krause's numbered crown glass. By the year 1910, she was shipping winter fruit to 23 hotels in California and Nevada. In 1912, she signed an arrangement with the University of California at Berkeley to license her late husband's scrubber design free of royalty to any California horticultural station that asked. By 1922, when Ingrid Halvorsen retired from active management at the age of 78, her scrubber and her radiant pipe design had been replicated with her free license at 47 horticultural stations in California, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, and Idaho. In the spring of 1908, a delegation of the Pacific Horticultural Society, led by Berkeley professor of plant physiology Eugene Hilgard, climbed up to the original Halvorsen greenhouse and spent 4 days measuring its interior temperature gradient, the chemistry of its scrubber effluent, and the morphology of the 3rd-generation pineapples in the central bed. Their report, published in the Society's annual for 1909, called the Halvorsen design the most sustained piece of geothermal horticultural engineering, then in operation west of the Mississippi. The report named the scrubber, in print, the Halvorsen stage filter. Ingrid Halvorsen, asked her opinion of the name, replied only that her husband had drawn it first. Esperanza Morales, who had married Thomas Vargas in 1891 and who had inherited the operating management in 1922, ran the Halvorsen greenhouses until 1941 and trained, in turn, 3 apprentices of her own. Ingrid Halvorsen passed quietly on the 14th of March, 1924, at the age of 80, in the cabin on the flank of Lassen Peak, with Esperanza Morales holding her hand. She was buried in the meadow beside Halldór. The 2 markers faced the line of 3 steaming fumaroles, the big whistler and the lady's sigh and the soft hiss, in the basin Halldór named the Devil's Garden. On the 14th of May, 1947, the Lassen Volcanic National Park, which had been established by Act of Congress in 1916 after the Great Lassen eruption sequence of 1914-17, bolted a bronze plaque to a fieldstone marker on the meadow above the cabin site. The plaque reads, in raised brass letters, "In memory of Ingrid Halvorsen, 1844 to 1924, who tapped the breath of the mountain without harming it and fed the children of the valley in the hard winter of 1889. In 1972, the surviving stone foundation of the original 80-foot greenhouse, with its 3 intact scrubber chambers, was entered on the National Register of Historic Places under the name Halvorsen Geothermal Glass House. The Halvorsen glass on the Tehama County Courthouse grounds in Red Bluff still stands, rebuilt twice, restored most recently in 1996. Every year on the 8th of May, the Red Bluff Methodist Episcopal Church holds a small service inside the glass. Every year, the descendants of the 49 children of January 1889, now scattered into the 8th generation across Northern California, send a small basket of citrus to the service. The first basket every year is sent by the family of Eliza Pemberton, who lived to the age of 93, and who told the story to her own grandchildren in the precise order in which it had happened. The basket carries each year 3 Valencia oranges, 3 Eureka lemons, 3 Mexican limes, and 1 Cayenne pineapple. The pineapple is grown every year in the original Halvorsen geothermal glass house on the flank of Lassen Peak, which has now been operated for 138 winters in continuous succession by Ingrid Halvorsen and her successors since the morning of the 14th of May, 1887, when a 43-year-old Norwegian widow turned a brass valve and let the washed breath of the earth, gentled by limestone and charcoal, climb a copper heat exchanger and warm the cast-iron pipes that ran along the floor of an 80-foot redwood-and-glass greenhouse on the southwest flank of Lassen Peak. The washed breath of the earth, Halldor Halvorsen had written in his blue ink margin in 1883, is gentle. His widow had spent the rest of her life proving him right.